and welcome to World Insight with Tian Wei, coming to you live from Beijing on CGTN. Coming up on today's program, the 11 remaining nations of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, also known as TPP, are in Japan trying to finalize a deal. Can Japan resurrect a successful economic deal in the absence of the U.S.? The Secretary General of the CPC, Chinese Communist Party, Xi Jinping's opening address at the 19th CPC National Congress placed a great emphasis on agriculture and rural areas. Can breakthroughs in food production keep pace with the world's growing population? And we begin today's program in Japan, where negotiators from the 11 remaining Trans-Pacific Partnership members began a three-day meeting on Monday. Japan hopes to finalize the deal to show their and other nations that it can act as a champion of free trade without the big brother, the United States. Originally, the United States was also a member of TPP, as we know, but talks were thrown into the limbo in January when U.S. President Donald Trump withdrew from the agreement to prioritize protecting U.S. jobs. In February 2016, 12 countries that border the Pacific Ocean signed up to this TPP agreement. The pact aimed to deepen economic ties between the nations, slashing tariffs and fostering trade to boost the growth. Now, the leaders of the 11 countries also are expected to meet on the sidelines of the APEC forum in Vietnam later in early November. So, will the 11 remaining nations of the TPP reach a final deal? If there were a chance, what kind of deal would it be like? We are now joined in our studio by Mr. Zhang Jinping, who is the Director General of the Center for Regional Cooperation at the Chinese Academy of International Trade and Economic Cooperation. He's been following, of course, the TPP issue for quite some time. Also joining us in Tokyo, we have Yorizumi Watanabe, Professor of International Political Economy. Welcome. In Washington, D.C., we would like to welcome Gary Hupbauer, Regional Jones, the Senior Fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Welcome. I want to start with you, Mr. Watanabe. 11 members of the TPP still remain. We understand for the opening day of the three-day meeting, it is about New Zealand and about Vietnam. Do we see much hope of TPP be remained among these 11 nations, judging from the negotiations between these two countries?
Well, thank you very much for having me here again. Good to see you, Ms. Tian Wei. Yes, certainly, because now New Zealand is back at the table for the negotiation, even in the absence of the United States. So TPP 11, I think it is on the process of forging its consensus towards the APEC meeting that is to be held in about 10 days' time.
Professor Watanabe,
so
if I
it
could...
is the final chance.
Yeah. If I could, besides cheerleading, ask two specific questions about New Zealand. A lot of labor issues involved in New Zealand's access to the TPP. And actually, New Zealand has been quite wary about the TPP issue because the new president, prime minister coming in after the TPP deal was reached. She only came into power recently. Secondly, about Vietnam. Vietnam has always been very concerned about the TPP without the United States because most of its exports, as a result of TPP, are mainly going to the United States in order to make more bucks. So what about these two countries? Can they solve their problems with the other members?
Well, I still believe that they could solve the problems.
How?
As I mentioned with the New Zealand, New Zealand Prime Minister made it clear that only after 4 years of her appointment as a Prime Minister, she is now ready to come back to TPP 11 deal. So that's already good for the rest of the TPP 11. And as for Vietnam, Vietnam certainly looks United States market as the primary market for their export. But there are a number of other issues that Vietnam can take advantage from TPP 11. So,
for example,
hopefully,
for example,
yeah, for example, they will enlarge their export possibilities into Japanese market beyond the bilateral economic partnership agreement between Vietnam and Japan. And they could expect more investment coming into Vietnam because Vietnam, if it stays within TPP, this production network, that is to be more strengthened by this TPP arrangement. So, for instance, more Japanese investment certainly go into Vietnam, choosing Vietnam as a primary sort of destination for Japanese investment.
All right. But the thing is, Mr. Hofbauer, can Japan, even with a vibrant economy, be able to take the place of the United States, which the U.S. left behind as a pillar of the TPP? Is this a much shrinking, if there were any deal later, and also disappointing deal to you?
Yes, absolutely. Japan can take the leadership. Prime Minister Abe is very strong now, had a very successful election. After the United States, Japan is the second largest market, and that's the glue for the TPP to go forward. That is accessed by other countries, Vietnam and all the others, to the Japanese market. So I'm very confident that under Japanese leadership, the TPP 11 will go forward. And even beyond that, once it comes into force, which could be January 2019, I'm expecting that Japan would welcome other countries to join the TPP.
Are you saying Japan might be welcoming the United States to join? Could the United States think about that under the Trump administration?
Oh, yeah. Well, absolutely. Japan has already said, or rather Prime Minister Abe has said, that he would welcome the United States to reconsider its views on TPP.
Right.
There will be no reconsideration during the Trump administration, but the next administration might take a different view, and Japan would like the U.S. to come back into the TPP once it's formed. And I think if you take a period of 4 or 5 years, this is a genuine possibility.
All right.
Not now, obviously.
Okay. We see the other two panelists. They are coming in from their own perspectives. Of course, both of them are pro-trade and also pro the idea of TPP originally. But of course, Mr. Zhang here in Beijing, originally it was 40% of the global GDP that we were talking about when the U.S. was signing to the TPP. But now with it coming out, nobody would assume any market could take the place of the United States market, to be just frank, if we look at any of those numbers. But will it have a new meaning, let's just say? Will it have still some steam left in this mechanism?
Yeah, I think that those TPP members have already have more than 5 years negotiations on that, and they formulated a long text for agreement, and many fields, more than about 29 fields included.
Yeah.
So actually, they pay so a lot of attention on those tariff issues, non-tariff issues, and those issues behind the borders, something like that. So I'm afraid that the rest of 11 members still make consensus on those issues, but just on some of more detailed issues, maybe there are some of new concerns, new problems, but they will have a new round of negotiations to solve those small issues. But generally, I think that the most of issues they already make consensus. So in this regard, my judgment is that it would be very possible for them to make new agreements.
At this point, Mr. Hofbauer, we see 3 ways from the Trump administration since it came into power about its ways of dealing with international and bilateral trade. Several things experts point to. One is try to use domestic trade laws toward international trade to consolidate the executive power of the White House in that regard. Secondly, is to put multilateral more into bilateral format to have a bigger say in any trade deals. And thirdly, of course, we all know is to further withdraw from the international trading system and regional trading system. What would this combine eventually mean for the U.S. trading capabilities and investment capabilities toward the other countries? Mr. Hofbauer, I know this is a profound and big question, but I know you've been doing research about that for a long time, so I hope to have some analytical views from you.
Well, thank you. You have summarized exactly what the Trump administration is doing, and what it is doing is shrinking the U.S. role in the world economy by renegotiating NAFTA, by new amendments to the Korea-U.S. agreement, and so forth. Much will depend on what other countries do. If other countries, in the case of TPP, come together and form a TPP 11, and if somehow Britain and the European Union can work out their relationship, and the European Union and Japan can form a new agreement, well, then the outlook is not so dismal. However, if other countries follow what the U.S. is doing, which is basically to raise barriers to trade, well, then that won't be good for the world economy. That will be very bad for the world economy. The growth of trade has been one of the main strengths of the world economy for the past 70 years. So this would be unfortunate. But I think that other countries will take a more sensible view than the current U.S. administration.
But Mr. Hofbauer, I hope I could be as optimistic as you just said at the very last of your answer. Yet you do see the inward-looking trend that we are facing today, not just in one country, but in quite a number of countries worldwide, with political elections, with regional debates, with regionalizations failures here and there. Mr. Hofbauer, it seems that the U.S. has quite a number of followers.
Yeah. Well, you are right. There are a lot of adverse trends, populist trends against globalization. China will play an absolutely key role in this. If China also restricts international investment, international trade, well, then if you have the U.S. and China both doing it, those are the two largest economic powers, that will be very bad. But I think, based on what President Xi has said at the 19th Party Congress, China has a very different view, or at least talks about a very different view. So I'm expecting China to step up its engagement with other countries. I think it's even possible, you know, I know it sounds far-fetched, but I think it would be possible in 5 years' time, perhaps, for China to think about joining the TPP.
So far, no decision has been really talked about in that direction. We'll see what's going to happen, or maybe some other trade mechanism. Nobody knows how the world will be like in 5 years. Professor Watanabe, though, I want to come back to you. Now, politically, Japan seems to be quite settled at this point. So what can be Japan's role for international trade? Professor Watanabe, I also noticed that in the Japanese press and in public domain, there has already been quite sharp criticism from Japanese scholars toward, let's just say, the United States right now. So the rise of Japan in trade mechanisms like this, what would it mean also to Japan's relations with the United States, in which, of course, trade is one of the most critical factors? Professor Watanabe.
Okay, thank you very much. You see, all those three countries, like Japan, United States, China, we are all members to WTO. But if we look at WTO, actually, since the end of the Uruguay round negotiation back in 1994, we haven't made so much progress in the rule making to adjust this trade edifice, such as WTO, to be adopted to the a lot of changes over time on the international trade issues. So you see the Doha Development Agenda, so-called Doha Round, has been constantly failing in producing tangible results.
Yeah.
So TPP and all other mega FTAs such as RCEP, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, as well as JCK, Japan, China, Korea FTA, both of which China is inherent member to, those are the new mechanism to create new trade-related rules, which has been quite missing in the WTO. So Japan takes a good care of those mega FTAs, TPP, JCK, trilateral FTA, as well as RCEP. And Japan has recently concluded bilateral EPA, which is FTA, with the European Union, and we would like to see the finalization of this Japan-EU bilateral EPA. So you see, that is also covering about 30% of world GDP.
Okay.
So altogether, those mega FTAs, including Japan-EU EPA, Japan would like to develop into the very well-established network of mega FTAs, and with the results of those FTA negotiations, we would like to bring them back to the WTO, such new rules on investment, competition policy, government procurement, and so forth.
Yes, Mr. Zhang here in Beijing, when you see the United States is where it is, we don't need to have further words to describe it, everybody knows. When you see Professor Watanabe just suggested Japan wants to remain an active role and also be able to push from its own perspective what they consider as free trade, what will be the role of China? And at this point, TPP originally was not, China was not invited, China was not part of the discussion about how they should be formed. If that is not what China is looking at, being the second largest economy of the world, what are some of the most important mechanisms is China looking at that China consider will be the pillars of the current trade system? Professor Zhang.
Okay. For the U.S., I think that even if now they are paying attention on bilateral FTA, but in the future, maybe they still need to consider multilateral. And for Japan, we are very happy to see Japan becomes more and more positive to promote regional cooperation. Actually, from Chinese view, I think that we have a very clear picture on both promoting globalization and regional integration. That means we will promote WTO, WTO related negotiations. Meanwhile, we also will focus on China's RTA network, construction. For example, now our top priority, that is RCEP. As well as other bilateral and trilateral free trade agreements. Meanwhile, from Chinese side, we have a very clear saying, that is, we will create our new RTA network, aiming for on the platform of Belt and Road Initiative.
RTA network, you are meaning?
Actually, regional trade agreement network.
I see.
Aiming for global, actually every country in the world, in case that country has a willing to have bilateral or multilateral free trade agreement with Chinese side.
Of course, the Chinese 19th CPC Congress has won a lot of attention from all over the world. Mr. Hofbauer, you probably have also been carefully listened in to that report delivered by Xi Jinping about the global community of shared future, the relations between big powers, and also the Belt and Road Initiative. These are all new ideas, perceptions, and initiatives brought up by this administration. how will they, from your perspective, work with our belief, which is free trade, because it has been the engine of the world growth for quite some time? Ms. Hofbauer, is there some space that when the U.S. President Donald Trump coming to China, when the two presidents sitting down with one another, they can talk about, not only between them, but also better for the international and global trading systems?
Well, that would be great if it happened. I think most of the conversation between President Xi and President Trump will be about North Korea, not about the trading system. However, for the trading system, if China follows with concrete actions the declarations made by President Xi at the 19th Party Congress, China can be the leader of the next phase of world economic integration with the Belt and Road Initiative, as you said, which involves a tremendous amount of money and engineering expertise, but with the RCEP, as the Director General has mentioned, and possibly, as I mentioned, with eventual membership in the TPP. And then right now, in December, there's going to be a meeting of the WTO. I know the U.S. is not looking for any declaration from that. But again, if China steps up and takes a leadership role, this could be a very constructive thing. So I'm putting a lot of hope on China.
A lot of time posts here, Mr. Zhang. Bilateral meeting between the two presidents in U.S. and China, two of the largest economies in the world, likely in 1 week. Secondly, APEC, CEO Forum, and also APEC Summit. The two presidents and some of the other economies, the state leaders, going to be there. Thirdly, you got a WTO meeting, as Mr. Hofbauer just mentioned, at the end of the year. Quite a number of time posts to let the world assess where we are and where we are going. Mr. Zhang, what could happen with China's side?
Yeah. All of those belong into tough missions for both China and the U.S. You know that China and the U.S. economic relationship is the most important bilateral relationship in the world. Also, we hope that we can keep stable and rational relationship and benefit for global development. Also, for WTO and APEC, just before I mentioned that for Chinese side, we both appreciate globalization and regional cooperation, especially on those different platforms. Today, China can play more and more important role and constructive role. So in this regard, I hope we can cooperate with other members.
I see. Well, we hope a lot of things could happen in the positive direction for better of the world. But for now, I have to say goodbye to the three of you, though I want to express my appreciation for your helping us to understand some of the most important factors in the global trade. Jiang Jinping, Yorizumi Watanabe, Gary Hofbauer. Really appreciate it, gentlemen, for being with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And you're watching World Insight with Tian Wei. Still to come on our program. Xi Jinping's opening address at the 19th CPC National Congress placed a great emphasis on agriculture and rural areas. Can technological innovations ensure food security in China and abroad? Meanwhile, what kind of rural China are we going to see in the future? We'll be back after this. Welcome back. You're watching World Insight with Tian Wei, coming to you live from Beijing Monday to Friday on CGTN. China has pledged to extend the land use contracts for farmers for another 30 years. Chinese President Xi Jinping laid out a policy blueprint for agriculture and rural area development in his party work report 2 weeks ago. With only 10% of the world's arable land, China produces food for 20% of the world's population. It deems agriculture key to the stability of the country and the well-being of its people. In recent years, China has applied more technological innovations in agriculture to maintain sustainable growth. So what are the achievements and the challenges in the agricultural development and food security? And what kind of rural China are we going to see in the near future? For more on agricultural innovation and China's future in the rural areas. We are joined in our studio by two guests, Shi Yan, who is the Executive Director of Shared Harvest CSA Farm in Beijing. CSA stands for Community Support Agriculture. Welcome to our program. Joining us also in Beijing, Liu Baocheng, Dean of the Center for International Business Ethics from the University of International Business and Economics. Joining us in Indiana, the United States, Holly Wang, Agricultural Economic Professor at Purdue University, who's also with the Qianren Global Expert Program of China Academy of Agricultural Sciences. Mainly that is a program soliciting talents, Chinese talents from all over the world, helping China to develop agricultural policies. Welcome. So, to you, may I ask you, Shi, what does all of the new goals and purposes illustrated by the 19th Party Congress report mean to a community supporting agriculture expert like you?
I think this report really focuses on a new strategy.
What is it?
It's Rural Regeneration National Strategy. I think that means
rural rejuvenation.
Regeneration.
Regeneration.
Yeah.
Explain, please.
So it's not means just focus on agriculture industry, but also focus on people who live in the rural and also the culture of agriculture.
What exactly is the culture of agriculture that you are referring to?
Like people who live in the rural and who their way of life, how they they're in the village, what kind of institution in the village is not different. It's not the same with the city. So there are a lot of different cultures in the rural village. We don't need to cover the culture with the culture of city.
You mean we don't need to replace that culture with the culture of city? Seems that you've been working in rural areas for long, not practicing your English much. But we have Ms. Shi, actually, she is a doctor in agricultural development, doctor degree, and also she's been working in rural areas for more than a decade, trying to do her own experiments. So her voice needs to be heard. But what about you, Ms. Wang from Purdue University? You've been doing research in an academic way about China's agriculture development. Do you agree with what Ms. Shi just suggested?
Yes, I do, but I take a different angle. I look at the production, efficiency, productivity, and actual market demand. So I focus more on agricultural production and supply instead of rural development. And I think this 19th CPC set the tone that we will further improve the efficiency and the productivity. It actually says three very good proposals, strategic proposals, like opening up the supply side of the reform and applying high technology such as big data and internet to agriculture, and also furthermore reform the factor markets, including labor, land, and capital. And each of these three will have great implication to the Chinese agricultural productivity, efficiency, and competitiveness. Like, for example, what is the major problem that confines Chinese agricultural productivity? It is the scale. It is the land structure, actually. So as you said earlier, that this another 30 years of extension of the contractual system actually is a good news. It gives the investors and farmers the sense of ownership, even though it's not ownership yet. So that's good. Another thing is
we wait for another time for the another thing. We'll let the other speakers also talk about their thing as well. Professor Liu, you could tell already quite clearly these two ladies have very different views. One is talking about the scale and the modernization of the agricultural production here in China. The other is talking about, well, in rural China, there's just a different culture. You need to respect it and make sure there's a breathing ground for those rural and farmer workers there. So, Professor Liu, what about where you stand? Help us understand.
Well, I grew up in the countryside, and I just hate the existing culture over there because that's why so many nearly 300 million people migrate into the cities. So they are not really content, number one, with the small farm or under the household responsibility system. Number two is that the countryside is no longer as beautiful as people might imagine. Everywhere there's pesticide, chemicals, etc. So if we do want a culture, we need to rejuvenate this culture instead of to stay at the status quo. So I totally agree with the lady on the other side. Is that productivity, quality are the mainstay. So in order to do that, we need to have institutional reform, to have skill operation, and the other is to have better quality control in an organized way.
Okay, we're going to ask you as to how that could be done with what kinds of building and institutional establishments. But now let me go to you, Ms. Shi. You are a lone fighter, it seems, in this discussion because I will be neutral. So help us to understand why you stand so firm from your own perspective. I hope it's not just because your farm that you're running. I guess it's not just because of that, but rather more than that. What is it?
Because nowadays our urbanization rate is about 50%. In the future, our goal is about 80% of the urbanization, but we still have 20% of Chinese population living in the rural. So in a long term, we still a small scale farmers kind of style. So we can't copy, we can't copy the model of United States or Australia because they have a different background of history, how the farmers become a farmer in their states. But in China, we are indigenous farmers state. Our farmers, we can't really, become 1,000 acres of land of farms.
What kind of small scale are you talking about when you are saying small scale?
It means family farms.
Family farm, like of how big usually? What is the average?
In the past, every farmer has about 1.3 mu of land, one farmer. But in the future, I think a appropriate scale of family farm probably would be 50 mu.
Yeah, but
it's still a small farm.
But you heard from Holly that, first of all, people can't make money out of that unless they got big supply from the government for subsidies. But that, is not going to last for long term, right? And secondly, there are problems, social problems, environmental problems in the rural areas. Why do you insist that those farmers have to stay where they are while you and your other friends could celebrate urban life? Even though you choose to have a rural life, but you are doing social experiments. You cannot compare your life to all 20% of the farmers that are still remain on their land.
I think
what is the argument?
How farmers can make money. If you compare with the United States or European countries, you could say actually the farmers who earn their money is not only depending on selling their agricultural products. Actually, those developed countries, they give their farmers a lot of subsidy to become a farmer.
You just said you cannot copy the United States and Australia's model, right? And you are suggesting we are copying those models.
So our modernization, to my opinion, is to how we can reorganize the farmers as a cooperative.
I'll let the experts to go with your discussion. Professor Liu, briefly.
Well, I think right now, if you look at the current status of the villages, which I frequently visit because my hometown is still there, and who are left over there, the main workforce are gone. It's not a rare phenomenon. So they would rather work 10 hours in the assembly line than doing on a farm. So the Chinese agriculture is no longer a small child sitting on the back of the cow and blowing the flue.
Not that romantic as you see in the watercolor painting.
Exactly. So right now, without the right organization, without a combination of technology and capital, without mechanization, you can hardly move forward. So right now, China, particularly for China, we do need mechanization and modernization in a way because we have almost 20% of the whole world population, but we only have 7% of the world arable land.
According to the Agriculture Ministry, the income of Chinese farmers has grown by nearly, 50% over the past 5 years, with 7 million people returning to the countryside, 7 million only to start new businesses. I want to go back to you, Ms. Wang, in Purdue University. What do all of this say to you? You know, there are so many things that we need to deal with when we talk about rural China. There is the environmental issue, there is a social issue, you know, left behind children, migrant workers, arable land, many of those issues. There's also the issue of what kinds of production model you want to have. That probably is the one that we've been debating of. And meanwhile, there is the issue of what kind of lifestyle do people genuinely want and want to have for their own choice. All of this mixed up together with anti-poverty and some of the other big goals that China has set for itself make things ever more complicated. Professor Wang in Purdue, what do you think should be the priority, and where is the strength to link all of these things together?
There are three aspects in rural and agriculture. We're talking about that, the farmers and the rural society and agriculture. So first, in the agriculture, we're looking at modern agriculture. And you mentioned that there's 7 million people coming back with perhaps investment money as well. So these are different people than the traditional one who lives in the rural areas. Right. These are the younger ones with the education, with the high skills, and more open to the new technologies. So they are the hope to really build a modern agriculture and using all these new technologies. And on the other hand, our other speakers talk about the 80% goal of urbanization. So many of the current rural residents will be no longer farmers in the long run, and those who remained there perhaps can also taking advantage of their small skills and taking advantage of the new technology to develop into the entire value chain of agriculture. Agriculture doesn't only mean cropping from the field or livestock husbandry. It now already covers the secondary industry, food processing, and food manufacturing, and tertiary that use the internet for retail. So these provide some small farmers some chance of making a nice life and income.
Okay. Ms. Shi, it seems that what the other two guests are saying totally going against what you are doing. You are promoting small farms, let's work together, let's bring in this better produce to the urban market, but you are only accounting for a very small part of China's agricultural development. And people cannot expect you and your friends to be able to feed the 1.4 billion that is living in this country. What would you say?
Actually, to my understanding and knowledge, to the FAO statistics, there are nowadays in all the world and also in China, our food are still supplied by 70% of the small farmers. Actually, it's not the biggest or big scale farmers are supplying our food. So I still believe if we really guarantee our food security, we have to guarantee we have farmers who growing food, not only big industrialized farms.
Right. Okay. On the other hand, Professor Liu, you see technologies, innovation, very much the idea these days. It really helped to bring up the production. It helped China to feed itself. Yuan Longping's technology has been such one applauded all over the world. So how much will those be really done? Let's just say, promote to those farmers that Ms. Shi has been talking about. That's a big question mark, not just to the big farms.
Well, I think Ms. Shi is talking about, post-modernization way of life. And right now, our objective is to modernize Chinese agriculture. Yes, in some suburban area like her farm, you can do so for the middle class or for the yappies, but not for the entire rural area. So Deng Xiaoping's reform motivated people to work very hard because they have the stronger sense of ownership. It's no longer the collective communes. But the limitation of the household responsibility is getting very obvious because, with a small piece of a cottage industry, you cannot do it, on scale, on productivity, etc. So we have to make a clear line between, food crop and cash crop. So for cash crop, smaller operation is doable. But for big food crop like corn, like sorghum and maize or rice, we have to do it on large scale by the combination of technology, of capital, and also information.
All right. I could tell none of you actually persuaded the other parties at this point in your discussion. That creates a necessity for us to debate it even further because the goals are being set, and yet the action plans are still to be initiated at this point. It's very important to have debates like this to make clear what our mind is really on the real thing. Thank you so much for the three of you for being with us. Shi Yan, Liu Baocheng, and the Holy Wang. Really appreciate it. Thank you. And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Insight CGTN in your search engine or check out our YouTube channel. Find us also on Twitter, Facebook, and Weibo here in China. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching, and tune in again next time for insights across China and around the world. Good night.